Greetings and welcome. My name is Jake Grayson. I'm a forest gardener and forest garden designer, and this is a online workshop all about perennial vegetables. And this is part of my Create a Backyard Forest free preview of my online course, Create a Backyard Forest. So this, just in case you haven't come across one of these before, I'm live streaming them every Wednesday, 10 a.m. British summertime. The slideshow is always available online. This one is forestgarden.wales/course/veg, and if you press P, you get to see all the copious notes that I create for each of the slides. And this slideshow will always be available, and will be updated from time to time, but will always be there. So if you ever need to get hold of a link or to get hold of some information, this is where you can go. So press P, hides the notes, and then in terms of the overall course, I'll just run through this. This is number 5. Blimey, over halfway there. So this is number 5 in the 8 kind of workshops that I'm doing, and I kind of like to think of this in 3 different parts, and it actually helps when you're when you're building and creating a forest garden to think of it like this. The first 3, introducing a forest garden, is an introduction about the scope of it. Second one is planning, is getting together the observations and putting together your wish lists. And the third one is the actual design, where you're moving things around on your map of the land. And you can do those kind of generally, this is what you do at the beginning. And then you can always have a bit of a break. You don't have to do everything all at the same time. This is what I try to do, and I wouldn't recommend it. I'd just say kind of pace yourself. This is a process, and it'll take a few. It can take a few years. Don't try and you don't have to get it all done in a year. So yeah, you'd be hard pushed to, but yeah, you don't have to. And then the next 3 really are the key for me. This is when you start getting your hands really dirty. This is the key part, and it's the protection is all about the windbreaks and protecting from the elements. So this is last week's workshop, but it's really about creating getting the garden so that it's protected, and that you're creating a microclimate. You're creating an environment where your ecosystem can get established. So that's the absolute kind of critical importance before you really do anything else. I mean, once you've done all your planning and you started propagating ground cover plants and windbreaks and all that, but really this is the bit that you want to be doing, is to protect that space and then enable that ecosystem to get established. Here in West Wales, I've had a real kind of issue with the wind. So I wish, going back 5 years, that I'd put more windbreaks in from the beginning, and double windbreaks as well where you possibly can, because we're exposed here, and there's a lot of plants that have had a hell of a time about it. And it's not just about individual. It's not just about the wind damage that they're getting, but it's also about how the plants sit within the garden as a whole. So, for example, I've got some fruit bushes which are kind of near to some ash trees, and it's a particularly dry part of the garden, and they've had a particularly hard time. So, when you're talking about protecting, it's also it's kind of looking after sort of protecting and thinking about the broader way of being able to encourage the plants to get established. So I would do things. Obviously, I would do things kind of differently, but that's part of the process of learning. So thanks to this work, thanks to all the people who've joined in, I've actually started to create another windbreak, and I'm looking at using Joster berries as a windbreak hedge, and I'm putting an extra blackcurrant windbreak hedge, a little mini windbreak hedge to protect the kind of more exposed part. So it's all part of that process. I'm waffling. So the other part of that is perennial vegetables, and the reason I put perennial vegetables into this kind of this second third is because perennial vegetables, you can start growing them, and you can get a harvest back from them kind of pretty quickly. They do take, depending what you're growing, but they do grow as fast, some of them grow as fast as annuals. So the kale, which is pictured here, I think it's Dorberton's kale, it grows pretty darn quickly, and you can get harvest really quickly as well. And the beauty of it is, you start off with a perennial veg near the house, and then you start to plant, you start to work out into the rest of the garden. But you're getting a return, you're getting a harvest, and you can always expand the perennial vegetable area later on. But it's a good place to start to focus on productive food, particularly while you haven't even got your fruit bushes in the ground, or your fruit and nut trees, and it'll be a couple of years or few years before they start to produce. So perennial veg, you get a much quicker return on it. And then the third part of the third part of this kind of section is the canopy layer. And I really think what I would do, it depends on your situation, but like with a larger area and you've got a grass field, I think it's such a good idea to get the trees in, get your windbreak up, and then a bit further out you've got, the whole of the garden is protected. Start growing the perennial vegetables near to the house, but then you get your trees, you get your canopy layer, your big trees, get them established, and then make sure they're mulched. You can leave the grass there, but just make sure that there's a mulch to protect the trees, so the tree doesn't dry out. The key thing is so that the canopy layer doesn't. The canopy layer, the trees, the newly planted trees, don't dry out. They don't get rabbit damage, and they're not getting swamped by brambles, for example. So you just make sure there's some space around them. But apart from that, they'll get on and they'll grow. Meanwhile, you can get on with the rest of the garden. So set the kind of the boundaries, and then set the boundaries, get the protection in, get the trees in, and then perennial vegetables nearby, and get work out from that point on, and then slowly, bit by bit, you can expand and get the ground cover in, and then get the shrubs in. So that's the second part. And the third part, the ground preparation, clearing the ground to put in shrubs and ground cover. And I'll come on to that in more detail. Right then, that's an awful lot of talking for not a lot of slides. So today, what we're going to learn is the importance of accessibility. And yes, as a kind of general principle, it's about being able to access your crops. And I think that's something I didn't really think about when I put together a lot of the vegetable beds. A really simple example is I made some raised beds because I thought that's what you do in a garden, with plastic sheet mulch around them, because I thought that's what you do. And they're 1.5 meters wide. So I don't know what that is in metric, 3 and 4.5 feet or something. I don't know. So 1.5 meters wide, and this is too wide to reach the middle comfortably from both sides. So you're kind of constantly trying to sneaking on. If you make the beds narrower, 1.2 meters, they're much more accessible, and they're much easier to see what's going on and to keep on top of them and to access them. So that's the kind of idea about accessibility. And it's fundamental really for vegetables, particularly in the early stages of vegetables. And then I'm going to look at protecting your crops. We covered some of this last week, but it's always good to have a bit of repetition to get the issues in there. And then I'll do a whistle-stop tour of my top 10 perennial vegetables, and I will probably have some sort of countdown music as well. All right then, so that's what we're going to be doing today. And first up really is, why perennial vegetables? Why not just have annual vegetables? And there's a few reasons. I'm sure you will recognise them, because perennial vegetables, I've kind of separated it out into its own lecture, its own workshop. But really, they're an integral part of a forest garden. They're not separate. You're looking at the whole ecosystem, the whole garden, and they're a part of that. They don't stand by themselves. Whereas annual vegetables, on the other hand, are almost very often treated as separate to the rest of the garden. And it's a big shift. I think this is, I'll mention this again probably later on, but I think it's a really big shift, and I don't appreciate the amount of resistance there is to that shift. I'm not a massive, historically I'm not a massive vegetable gardener, but to move to perennial vegetables, you're using plants you don't know, you're growing plants you don't know for a start, and then you don't know how to grow them, you don't know how to harvest them, and you don't know how to cook them either. And that is actually really, really big. That's a really big barrier to the uptake of them. There's a huge cultural barrier to change. It's easier to stick with what you do know, which is annual vegetables. This is a photograph from Gleebland's market garden where I worked last summer for a few months, and it's exposed. It's they're a vegan organic market garden. It's all annual vegetables. It's a totally different model. They need the production. It's like a kind of vegan organic factory with minimum wages and yeah, it's kind of in some respects it's quite not grim, but it's hard bloody work. And yes, it's hard work, and it doesn't really need to be in that context. I mean, for a shop, if you're making money from it, this is what you need to do, and this probably is a part of the problem, is that everything is geared up to increasing efficiency, improving it, getting the maximum return from the amount of time and the amount of watering, and it's all about the money, and money is a kind of key driver for it. I think you have the luxury, if you're doing it for yourself, it's far more a part of your everyday life. So I think they're great, and I think that forest gardens are something different altogether. So the key thing about perennial vegetables is that they are more resilient. Last year we had a very dry patch. I think was June? I think it was possibly May, June last year. And the amount of watering that you have to do is absolutely crazy. I mean, you have drip lines, and for some of the crops you have to go out for the lettuce. I think here you had to go out every single day at one point and water and more watering, hours and hours and hours of watering, and laying out lines of watering pipes. Whereas perennial vegetables, once they're established, you don't need to water them, or very, very rarely, unless you're in a particularly dry spot. So they're much more resilient to changes in rainfall. They're also more nutritious as well. There has been research done on this. I don't think I've got any links on them to hand, but they are much more. They are more nutritious. If you look at an analysis of perennial vegetables as opposed to annual vegetables, there are more nutrients in them. I can try and find the links for that. And kind of really importantly is that it's the soil health and the wildlife. With annual vegetables, you're kind of constantly. It's a load of work. It's constantly sowing and pricking out and planting and weeding, and and then you're digging stuff up again. And even with a no dig system, it's a constant process, and it's a lot of work. And with perennial vegetables, there's much less disturbance of the soil. You're really only digging a hole to plant something, and you're only ever digging a hole to harvest a root vegetable. Which is much better for the mycorrhizal networks in the soil, and for the soil health generally, and also the wildlife. So I think also it's worth pointing out, and this is something that Pam in the chat last week pointed out too, that forest gardens generally, and perennial vegetables in particular, are particularly good if you want a lower maintenance for the way that you live. So that if you're getting older, like what I am, then it makes it easier for you for your later years. It's not so much effort. It really isn't. Once it's established, it's not so much effort. And a big shout out here to Alison Tyndale from Backyard Larder. She's written a couple of blog posts about vegetables for the venerable, and saying for her parents who are elderly, it's the perennial vegetables are the stars of the show because they just kind of keep on going with very little maintenance. There's a couple of links in the notes here. So accessibility, yeah, the importance of accessibility to vegetables, to perennial vegetables. First of all, paths. I kind of when I kind of created my forest garden, I haven't really got many paths anywhere. It's kind of big swathes of land, and I just planted all sorts of stuff in there, and it's gone a bit wild, which is fine, but you need to have access to the vegetables to be able to see how they're getting on, and see if they're getting swamped, and see if they need if they do need any watering if they're new plants. So paths are kind of fundamentally important. What do I say? People paths lead to attention. That if you've got a path somewhere, then you can actually access the plants that are growing, and you can see what's going on. So what I will be doing, and I've started the process of doing, is to create wood chip paths into the centre of the beds that I've already created, and have, I don't know what they're called, like keyhole. Can I draw something somewhere? I think it's well, it's like a keyhole garden, but you have a bed. So if you've got like, I'll do a little sketch, impromptu sketch. Let me have a look on here. It's that kind of thing where you have a bed and it goes up. You try doing this in the webcam. Then the bed goes up and you can go in, and then you can access all the way around the kind of mushroom shaped path that you've got here. Yep. So that's the thing that I've started to do, and I started to use wood chip really just to kind of keep to demarcate the path. And it doesn't matter if stuff grows over it, but just to kind of keep on accessing it and keep it active. Yep. So I think that's really, really important. I'm planning these paths in. Now, most of the paths that I've got here, this is actually something I really need to kind of, I don't know whether this should be a separate thing, but most of the paths I've got are grass paths. And grass is, the good thing about grass is that it's resilient and it grows like crazy. And the bad thing about grass is that it's resilient and then it grows like crazy. It just can take over. It can creep into stuff, and it just takes so much bloody maintenance for a grass path. If you want to kind of keep it in control, so that you can actually access stuff without a load of grass growing up, you need to cut it like once a month or so to be able to get through, and it's a lot of work. So what I've been doing is to reduce the amount of grass paths. I did have like 2 meter wide paths, but now I'm just taking all the grass back. And my plan now is to use wood chip, just kind of set out in certain high density areas, is to use wood chip as a kind of path in to like the perennial vegetables, to the higher turnover vegetables, and then work out from there which bits I use the most, and then let the ground cover the parts I'm not using, but to maintain some sort of kind of path going on, and then just top that up every few years. So that's my new kind of approach to paths. The other one is signage. Now this is kind of talking about, I was saying earlier on about the knowledge of the different plants that you've got. What I have found is that if you know where things are, and you know what they're called, then they're an awful lot easier to harvest, and they're an awful lot easier to control. And what I mean by this is, I'll ask my partner, he said, can you go and pick some spinach type plant for, we're going to have a sarg curry or something. And she goes, well, I'm not terribly sure where that is. And I'll say, you could use the leaves off of the Turkish rocket, or you could use some Good King Henry, or whatever the vegetable is, and she won't know where they are. So what I'm doing is to put areas of particular kind of groups of plants, so that other people know where they are and know what to look out for, and then put a big sign there saying spinach, cabbage, onions, and then you go, oh yeah, okay, that's fine, this is what I'm going for. So it makes life a lot easier, and that's not for the plant, that's for people using it. Is to make it the accessibility is to make it easy for other people to partake in the garden and to kind of get involved. And it's the same thing for the kids as well. I kind of keep on about the names for different plants and where things are, so that they understand what's growing and what's growing where. And the kind of signs really do help with this. I will just mention about the beds. So what I'm doing with the beds here, I'm getting rid of the sheet mulch, plastic sheet mulch, trying to get rid of sheet mulch, plastic sheet mulch just generally, and replacing it with wood chip. And then where the grass is, I'm putting logs, small kind of branches, logs, straight logs down the side of it to keep the grass on one side, wood chip on the other side. And then I'll be taking off I won't be having raised beds anymore. There is a bit of a slope, so I'll keep the bit of wood at the bottom to stop the soil from coming down, but I'll take the wood off the sides and the top, and then have wood chip paths. And I kind of feel happier about that. Raised beds don't really do an awful lot. You don't need to have raised beds. And then we'll see how it evolves, just in terms of the width of the beds and where things are grown. And I'm gradually trying out different perennial vegetables, and then I'll move away from annual vegetables. We'll still have annual vegetables like courgettes and chilies, and tomatoes, but and potatoes possibly. But the rest of the things move to lower maintenance veg, and try stuff out. Okay, so yeah, and another important aspect of accessibility is keeping it close to the kitchen, keeping the perennial vegetables close to the kitchen. So this permaculture idea of zoning, where you have the high intensity, high density, high maintenance stuff nearer the house, and less important, less maintenance stuff further away, and you break it up into different zones. And there's some vegetables like spinach, for example, and parsley or herbs or oregano or stuff like that, then that you keep closer to the kitchen because you use it on a daily basis. We've got a couple of bay leaves just out by the back door, and I use bay leaves pretty much every single day. I just reach out the window, grab a couple of bay leaves, and then cook with them. Have rather lopsided bay trees, and then the stuff you don't use so much. So I'm experimenting with potato onions, which are essentially shallots, but like large shallots as a kind of replacement for onions. And they kind of take a while to grow, and I'll have them further away. Yeah, so there's the stuff that you use on a daily basis, you keep close to the kitchen. The stuff you don't use so often, you keep further away. Another part of that, in terms of crops generally, is crops like cherries, where you want to really keep an eye on them, see how they're going. Keep the cherries closer to the house so you can keep an eye on them. And if you are netting, then you can get out there with a net, or you're picking them, you can get out and pick them before the birds get them. And that goes for the same for other kind of soft fruit as well. So most use closest, yeah, and you get herbs, salad, leafy greens, and then kind of work your way out. And then, as I mentioned before, I alluded to before, access to knowledge is really, really important here. There is such a big cultural barrier. Oh, I meant to put it on. There's such a big cultural barrier to the new plants and cooking with the plants, and growing, harvesting and cooking with the plants as well. So you've got to experiment. You've got to try different things out. There are some really, really good people out there doing a lot of good work. A big shout out to Alison at Backyard Larder. She sells perennial vegetables. Now, I have a what do you call it? I got to admission to make. Is that the right word? When I was thinking of the name for the course, I've called it Create a Backyard Forest, to appeal to people who think that you might need acres to grow a forest garden, whereas in actual fact you can do it in your backyard. my partner said, yeah, backyard forest. How about that? And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. But that does sound a bit familiar. And then I realised about a week ago that yes, it's really familiar. It's Alison's the name of Alison's business, Backyard Larder. So I've kind of written to her and apologised for that and say it really wasn't intentional. I've kind of done everything for that name, so I'm going to keep with it. She's kind of okay with it. So yes. So apologies to Alison, and I wish I'd thought of it sooner. I would have used a different name. But really good website. She does sign up for her newsletter. She does a regular newsletter, and she'll give an awful lot of detail about different plants. So like last newsletter is about seaweed. Also, Stephen Barstow, who's written a book around the world in 80 plants about edible plants. And he's got a website, edimentals.com. And really good, really fantastic, loads and loads of information. I mean, there's just so much information about so many different plants. And it's, if you want to find out about the vegetable that I'm really interested in, well, one of the vegetables I'm interested in at the moment is Udo, U-D-O. And he's got a lot of information about that and different cultivars and ways of cooking and using it. And so it's great. Just fantastic. And the Facebook group is good as well, Edibles and Perennial Vegetables, because people just posting stuff and saying, how do I do this? And what do I cook with this? And can you eat that? So that's totally recommended. And then Mandy Barber at Incredible Vegetables, incrediblevegetables.co.uk, I think. Again, sells perennial vegetables online. I haven't had so much to do with her. I haven't bought anything from her, but yeah, down in Devon, really, yeah, again, really good. And then, I've got the screenshots. And Plants for a Future. This is a fantastic resource. If you don't know this already, pfaf.org. It just gives you a whole range of information about growing conditions and what parts of the plant you can eat and all sorts. So it's absolutely invaluable. And yeah, do consider donating to them. Oh yes, attention. So attention. So yes, it's all kind of part of accessibility and attention and looking at what's going on. It's all related. It's all about being actually in the garden, and it's about looking at what's going on and then making decisions based on that. Now, I really do wish that there was some easy way of saying, here's a plan, here's some, I really would love to do this actually. Somebody else mentioned this. I really would like to do a combination of different polycultures. So if you have got any favourites, anybody in the chat, do let us know about different combinations of plants that work well together. In particular, I'm talking about generally, but also for perennial vegetables as well. Annie, for example, in a book, she's talking about walking tree onions and oca, I don't know how to pronounce it, the little red tubers from Peru. And she says they seem to grow fine. They seem to grow really well together, which is interesting because I've got a load of oca which have been growing with the potato onions, and I've been actually pulling out the oca because I go, well, I can't be bothered with it. Is it going to get in the way? But apparently not. So I could have left them. But that kind of thing. What kind of combinations work well together? Your guilds, as they are known in permaculture parlance. So that would be a really good thing to do, is to get some suggestions. So, but there isn't any kind of like plant this, it'll work well together. It's about planting stuff that works well together in a certain situation. And I wish, but there's this idea that you can just plonk a whole load of plants in a place and that will grow and that will work, the kind of formulaic approach to gardening. Whereas in actual fact, what you need, and this is true of any gardening, and this is true of vegetable gardening and kind of traditional ornamental gardening, what you need to cultivate most of all is attention, is your attention and your involvement and your presence in the garden. That's one of the most important things that you can cultivate. And I got this from working at the market garden last year. It really is about looking at the plants, what needs watering, what needs weeding. I mean, this is for annual vegetables, but the same principles apply. What's working, what isn't working so well, having and observing and looking at it, not jumping straight in, but being aware of what's kind of going on and tweaking the balance. Yes, you will. And the other side of this as well is that, it's not a forest garden is not a no maintenance garden. It's a low maintenance garden. There will always be a need to weed. Mostly in the forest garden here, this is they're kind of troublesome, but it's kind of keeping grass out, brambles and ash seedlings. So the kind of main ash and sycamore seedlings, and that's the main weeding. It's not like masses, and it's not yet established either. The other bits that are kind of you got to need keeping an eye on them, but creeping buttercup and plantain and dock. But again, Annie in her book says with the dock, she kind of cuts it back, make sure the flower heads don't set to seed, and then with the plantain and the creeping buttercup, you can just yank it up and just let it compost in situ, or just use a pair of scissors to cut it back, but not to be too obsessive about it. So I certainly haven't been obsessive about weeding in the forest garden, that's for sure. I think it's also worth looking at what grows naturally. So part of this process is to see what wild plants are growing in your garden and what kind of indications that gives to the kind of perennial vegetables and other forest garden plants that you can use. So I mentioned this before, we've got a lot of creeping buttercup which likes damp, rich soil, and it grows in precisely the same place as Nepalese raspberry. They seem to really like the same conditions. So that's what I'm growing in those conditions where the buttercup is. I'll put some more Nepalese raspberry plants in. And also do be aware that with a forest garden, it's unlike an ornamental garden or a traditional annual vegetable garden. You're keeping, you're keeping the garden at a very cultivated state. With a forest garden, the whole idea is to let the garden shift more towards woodland. So it's the edge of woodland is a state that you're aiming at. So you will have a shadier forest garden, and that does mean that the plants that you're growing will shift and change over time. So traditionally, alliums, well, not all alliums, but I think the majority of alliums like good, rich, free draining soil in full sun, for example. How true that is, I'm not too sure, but do be aware that you might have to move your alliums if a particular tree grows and you get more shade in a certain spot. So yeah, do think about shifting things around, but think about the longer term and whether the garden as a whole is moving to. So on to protection. Oh blimey, I'm doing it again. Right, yeah. So weeds. Now, I do think, I mentioned this last week. I mentioned there's the whole kind of workshop about protection, but I do think it's interesting about weeds is that a weed is a verb rather than thinking of a weed as a noun. A weed is a wild plant. A weed is really just a plant that you don't particularly want in a place. Whereas in actual fact, it's more useful to think of weeding as a verb. Now, in an established forest garden, there is minimal weeding. Like I mentioned before, you're just talking about taking out saplings and bramble and the odd dock, and that's kind of about it. Whereas if you're getting some young plants established, then that's when you need to be on top of giving those young plants some space. So in the photograph here, I ought to use a different photograph. In this photograph here, there's some Calendula officinalis, marigold, which I let grow on an annual vegetable bed. This is where slugs live. So the annual vegetables got absolutely hammered. I think it was beans or something there, but they got absolutely hammered by the slugs. So the weeding is just to reduce the habitat to let the plants get established. For forest garden plants, it's only the early stages that you've got to do this. So an example is I've got a gooseberry bush, which is I took from cuttings last autumn. Yeah, last autumn, and they're good. They're about 30 centimeters tall. Lots of young green growth, and I put it in a bed where there's ground ivy, Glaucoma heteracea, and the gooseberry bush. Honestly, the ground ivy is like that, and the gooseberry bush is like that. So I've just pulled the ground ivy back just to let that gooseberry bush get established. And that's all that I'm not properly. It's not even weeding. It's just pulling the stuff back to give it a bit of space, because ground ivy will kind of go up a small plant. So yes, so it's weeding like that. And then if you've got plants like Turkish rocket, is a case in point. Slugs love it, so I kind of grew it in an annual vegetable bed, and I'm going to move it this autumn. I'll move it to a perennial vegetable bed later. But just while it's getting established, I kept it weeded. I kept the ground free from other plants. Yes, and protecting from slugs in West Wales, not so bad this year, but the slugs are the big problem. But again, slugs are only a big problem in an annual vegetable garden with young, if you've got annual vegetables, you've got young plants year after year after year, and slugs will be a problem year after year. You have a 5-foot Portuguese kale, that slug is not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere near it. The kale will be absolutely fine. So it's about getting to that stage where you don't have to worry about slugs. And yeah, that's it really. It's kind of, you've got a problem with slugs, don't grow plants that slugs like. But maybe that's too simplistic. And wind, yep, protecting from wind. And I was saying about the vegetable patch. I'll just go back here. On the annual vegetable patch, that particular bit is exposed to the wind. So I'm growing a blackcurrant hedge, and in honor of Pam, I'm deturfing an area to reduce the width of the grass paths, making a mound about 1.5 foot high, which will settle down. And once it's settled down after a few months, I'll plant some blackcurrant bushes along the top of it, and that'll provide 1.5 meters, kind of a little windbreak hedge. And it's right next to the path, but that's fine. I can just keep it in check by pruning it, and it'll be fine. So it's a good use of space. But yes, windbreaks, so important. Kind of get a windbreak hedge in, get a dead hedge in, and then finally netting. To be honest, I haven't netted for pigeons here. We've had a couple of the pigeons a particular problem with large amounts of crops in one place. We've got a few Spanish Asturian tree cabbage and Portuguese kale, and we've had no problems at all with pigeons. We've got loads of wood pigeons around the place, but we've got maybe 6 or 7 different kale plants, and pigeons not an issue at all. So I really wouldn't worry about them. It does seem to be much more where there's a concentration of plants in one place. So again, this idea of creating a polyculture of guilds is where you have your kale plants are slightly, they're spread out, so they're in an area where there's other plants going on. So it's not just all one big clump of kale and the pigeons come in. You spread it out a bit, so you kind of bit more diverse. Where I do think netting is interesting is for fruit crops, soft fruit crops like cherries. But I'm not at that stage where we're actually eating any of the cherries. So it's worth bearing in mind, and I do know people who do use netting to kind of keep the crop. And if you are going to use netting, then do think about the size of your tree and the size of the rootstock. Off the top of my head, I don't know what cherry rootstock what size rootstock you want, but basically you want to have a quite a small rootstock, relatively small rootstock, so that you can get a net over the tree easily. You don't want to have something too big, like a 4-meter tree would be a bit of a nightmare to get netting onto, whereas if it's more like 2 meters, it's much easier. So kind of consider that when thinking about having a cherry tree. Okay, and my top bit of advice really is to treat perennial vegetables like annuals until they're perennial. So at the young stages, this is the Turkish rocket. Keep it, I'll keep it weeded with a compost mulch around it. Kind of get them going, and once they're established, then just treat them like perennials. But in the early stages, treat them like young plants, treat them like annuals, and that'll save you some headaches. And on that note, as I was saying, we've still got annual vegetables, and I've been kind of making compost with varying degrees of enthusiasm. But really, really simple. Keeping it really, really simple. Most of the stuff that we're chopping, so whether it's branches, I'll use small branches I'll put into dead hedges, and a lot of the other stuff I'll like cuttings of smaller branches, like tiny leaves and branches, I'll just let them compost in situ. There's no need to make compost. The only reason I'm making compost is because we're still kind of growing annual vegetables, but I can see that, and that's mostly just that will mostly just be for the polytunnel, and even then we're shifting over towards perennials bit by bit. But this is in the meantime, I'll keep on making compost. Just to give you a quick rundown for that, 3 bays. The sides are well, I would say 3 bays, sides optional. I would have sides on it, makes it easier to manage. 50-50 green waste, green kind of leaf and grass cuttings, and brown, which is kind of more stems and bits of old cardboard. Chop it up if you possibly can, because it makes the composting process easier. A sheet of plastic over the top keeps the moisture in, and if it stops it getting too wet and stops it from drying out. And the hard bit is turning it twice weekly. I haven't done it for a couple of weeks, but then I don't really need any compost at the moment, so I'm not that fussed by it. And then the other side is, well, if a forest garden is no dig. The whole point of a forest garden is that it's no dig. But if you are if you are growing any annual vegetables, check out Ruth Stout's kind of interesting. She's like a US pioneer of no dig back in the 1940s, 50s. And she was using straw. Don't use straw in the UK because you will get slugs. Charles Dowding, who you've probably heard of, is a UK advocate, and he advocates he says use compost mulch, and totally agree with that. Use a compost mulch because you won't get so many slug problems. And apply 1 inch in winter, and that's basically it. And you can see here I've got buckthorn plantain grows really, really easily, and it's a nice crop. There's one other thing actually I need to make a note of this too, is that with perennial vegetables, they kind of complement a lot of the annual vegetables, and you get what's called the hungry gap in June, where you've got your winter crops, like your cabbages, and you've got your overwintering chard and other carrots and other vegetables, and then you've got a bit of a gap in June before all the annual vegetables, the kind of summer crops come online, and the perennial vegetables fill that gap really nicely. And a buck's horn plantain is one of those plants. It's you can keep it. It's quite happy over winter, and it's got nice kind of sweetish, slightly hairy but sweet green leaves on it. So yes, I haven't really cooked with it that much, but it's interesting. It's an interesting plant. Alison sells it, and who else? The Real Seed Company sells it as well. But my point being that you can grow it as an annual vegetable, and that's how I've treated it. And then I'm going to plant it out as a perennial later on. Okay, top 10 perennial vegetables. I'll whiz through these because because I've done it again. I've gone right on chattering away. Okay, so number 1, no particular order, Caucasian spinach. It must be a great vegetable because it has its own Facebook group. It's a herbaceous perennial, which means it dies back every year, and it does climb. Now, it's really good. I found that it likes moist soil. I did have it in a bit of a dry spot once. I've never really grown it. I haven't really cropped it yet. I've only ever had it I've never had a place for it in the forest garden with a bit of shade and a bit of moist soil. And I haven't got to there's a bit that I want it to go into, but that bit's being used at the moment. But it tolerates full shade, so it's really good for a full shade. spot, and it's very productive as a spinach plant once you get established. Slugs do like it when it's younger, so do watch out for that. Alison Tyndale at Backyard Larder has got some in stock. I've got one which I will be moving later on, so that's a really exciting kind of spinach plant. It's brilliant. The daylilies, Hemerocallis, huge number of species, and this is of particular interest to ornamental gardeners and people who are interested. I'm kind of really interested in growing stuff for all sorts of different reasons for ornamental gardens, and so that daylilies are one of the plants I kind of would like to spend some more time finding out about, because you've got a huge range of different colours, and loads of them are edible, and it's quite they're very easy to grow. I think they're like full sun, 60 to 90 centimetres tall. My mum's got a rescue dog. I think it's a Staffordshire Bull Terrier. And he will eat anything, and my mum was out with him in the garden the other day, and he had his eye. She couldn't work out what was eating all the daylily buds, and he came along and just munched the entire flower. So he's got good taste in perennial vegetables. So really exciting, interesting plant. You can cook with them, and you can have them in salads. So well worth checking out. Welsh onion, Allium fistulosum. You use the leaves as chives. So when they get flower heads on them, they go tough. So yeah, be careful how you choose it. They're easy to grow, and they're very ornamental too. They're really lovely plants. And you can also use the bulbs as spring onions. You can divide them and then just take out one and use it as a spring onion. So they can use them as chives and spring onions. But the problem is they do die back in winter. A problem. But apparently there is an everlasting onion which does have fresh leaves all winter. The perutile. So that's what I haven't grown it myself, but that's worth checking out. But I really like Welsh onions. Yes, so that's all going to be going on in the new perennial vegetable beds that I'm just preparing now. Garden sorrel, yep, they're great. You can keep them chopped back. If they start flowering, you can cut them right back, and they'll come up again. Member of the dock family, so they're good mineral accumulators. And you can get non-flowering, not cultivars, I think, but you can get non-flowering garden sorrel. So they're great. Got a few of them. And Good King Henry. Now they're fantastic because you can eat the leaves, you can eat the shoots, you can steam the shoots like a little asparagus, and you can eat the seeds. So they're a member of the Chenopodium, so they're a member of the quinoa, same family as quinoa. And yeah, I find them really hard to propagate. So I've tried about 3 or 4 times, chilling the seed, put them in different conditions, no joy at all. But they self-seed like crazy, and I've ended up with about 20 or 30 Good King Henry plants. But they're really good, really kind of tough, resilient, and yeah, they're great. I really like them. And the perennial kale. Now you've got quite a lot of choice with perennial kale. Dauberton's kale and Taunton Dean are the two well-known ones. I've got a Portuguese kale, which is quite tough. I managed to lose my Dauberton's kale, but the Portuguese kale is quite tough, dark green leaves, and it's good. It's kind of, yeah, it's very resilient, and they can grow very tall as well. So just eat the younger leaves, remove the older outer leaves, and do keep an eye on the height. And then another one that we have is Asturian tree cabbage, and you can get the seeds from realseeds.co.uk, the seed company over in Wales. So yeah, perennial kale, can't do without that. And then perennial leek. Now I might be getting some. This is slightly different. There's a leek called Babington's leek, which again I have lost. So this is why I'm absolutely determined this year to have like a real kind of dedicated perennial vegetable area. But the Babington's leek are more garlicky, and they're quite thin. They look after themselves, but they are quite thin. Whereas the perennial leek, which is a cultivar of the wild leek, is different. This is kind of gets bigger and is more leek-like. So I will be getting some, which is from Alison at Backyard Larder. So St Victor X or Prii, however you pronounce that. And then Siberian purslane, just beautiful little plants, fleshy kind of green leaves. And I've tried to make it trying to grow it now as a ground cover. I say it likes damp conditions, but I've found it growing in the polytunnel. But I'm now it's quite low plant, and I'm trying to grow it as a ground cover, and you can use it in salads as well. Oh, and you can cook them. I didn't know that. And they do taste a bit like slightly earthy, like a beetrooty kind of flavour to them, but they're nice. And really like them. And Turkish Rocket. Now Turkish Rocket, this is the first year. This is last year's plant, and this is the first year that we've grown the flower buds. And I took a harvest. I harvested the flower buds, the first flush of them. Absolutely delicious. I mean, they taste amazing. They're just like, it's a really interesting, complex flavour. Someone said they taste like fish sauce, but they have got this meatiness to them, and they're just, really, strangely nice. So we're going to grow loads of that. I've let the second flush of flowers all go to seed, so I'll be growing this from seed, and they grow really, really easily from seed. But you do have to look out for slugs. So if anybody wants some of the seed, let me know, and I'll send it. I'll send you some seed when it gets ready later on this year. But they're really, really easy to grow, and they're just great. And you can eat the leaves, and you can eat the flower shoots. So they're fantastic plant, really, really good. I do like them a lot. And then finally, wild garlic. Now they do go a bit rampant in the spring, but they're like a good ground cover, and I'm going to combine it with ground ivy, otherwise known as alefoot. I'll be I'm going to have certain areas which are contained by paths, so I'm going to be growing ground ivy and ramsons in certain areas in like a little woodland area. And looking forward to that, and then actually being able to harvest handfuls of leaves and then cook them gently, just to keep the flavour. And that's my top 10. Obviously, there are loads and loads of other perennial vegetables. What I would really seriously recommend doing is, Martin Crawford's got a book out called Growing Perennial Vegetables, but to be honest, I wouldn't really bother with that. I'll just go with these Creating a Forest Garden, because most of them are listed in here. So have a look at this book, Creating a Forest Garden. Have a look at Stephen Barstow's Around the World in 80 Plants, and then look at the edimentals.com website. And there's another place as well, another chap who I haven't really been following that much, of plums and pig nuts. So that's me done for the day. Another hour, can't believe it. Backyard Forest takeaways, accessibility, attention, protection. Yeah, accessibility, just opening up the pathways in your mind, but also in your garden. And then treating annuals like perennials. Absolutely. The main bit of advice is to look after them when they're young. Don't just plant them and forget about them. And then Plants for a Future website as a reference. Those are my three takeaways from today. So I hope that's useful. It's a bit of an experiment, and it's a journey for me. So I'm not by no stretch of the imagination a perennial vegetable guru or anything like that. So do check out the people who are. Thank you very much. I'm going to hop over to Zoom and hopefully see you there. And I hope that was useful. Thank you. See you later. Bye.